She was nobody, a plus-sized waitress in a city that ate people like her for sport, invisible, indebted, and one cruel joke away from breaking completely. But the night they humiliated her in front of every person in that restaurant, the most feared man in New York stood up from his corner booth, straightened his jacket, and did something nobody in the underworld had ever seen him do. He chose her. Not his empire, not his reputation. Her. And that single choice was about to set the entire city on fire. Stay with me until the end, and drop a like and comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The rain had been falling since Tuesday, and by Thursday, it had turned the Bronx into something that felt punished. Gutters ran black with street grime. The smell of wet asphalt and diesel came through every crack in every wall, and inside Enzo's trattoria on Fordham Road, the windows had fogged so thick that the neon sign outside bled red against the glass like something wounded. Clara Whitmore had been on her feet for 9 hours. She knew it was 9 hours because she'd stopped checking the clock at the 7-hour mark. That was when hope became a liability. After 7 hours, you stopped counting toward the end and started just surviving the next table, the next order, the next comment muttered just loud enough for her to hear. She carried 3 plates of ossobuco to table 11 and set them down without spilling a drop, which was its own kind of victory considering the way her lower back had been screaming since noon. "Finally," said the man at the head of the table. He didn't look at her. He was already reaching for the plate before she'd finished placing it. She said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that silence was the only answer that didn't cost her anything. Claire was 28 years old, and she had the face of someone who had been quietly apologizing her entire life. Not for anything she'd done, but for the space she took up, the size of her body, the way she existed in rooms where people had already decided she shouldn't. She wore her dark hair pulled back tight because Enzo had once told her loose hair looked unprofessional, and she'd never questioned it. Same as she never questioned the uniform that fit wrong in the shoulders, or the rotation schedule that always gave her the worst Friday shifts, or the fact that her tips were consistently half what the other girls made for the same work. She was not invisible because she lacked presence. She was invisible because she had spent years perfecting the disappearing act, and the world had been more than willing to cooperate. The trattoria was 3/4 full by 7:30. It was that kind of place. Not fancy enough to be exclusive, but old enough to carry the weight of reputation. The booths along the east wall had hosted city councilmen and underbosses in the same week. The bar had dark wood the color of old blood, and bottles arranged with a precision that Enzo guarded personally. The kitchen smelled permanently of garlic and cigarettes, and the cook, a man named Bertolini who had been there longer than the current ownership, communicated exclusively through grunts that Clara had learned to interpret with the accuracy of a translator. She was halfway back to the service station when she clocked the corner booth. He was already there. Damien Voss didn't announce himself. He never did. He arrived the way weather arrived. You simply looked up one moment and realized the atmosphere had changed. He was 41 years old, built with the kind of contained density that came not from vanity, but from a body that had been through things and survived them. His suits were always dark, always fitted without being theatrical, and he wore them the way other men wore armor. Not for show, but because he understood that the world judged you in the first 3 seconds, and he had stopped caring to lose that particular fight. He sat alone. He always sat alone. Clara had worked Tuesday and Thursday evenings for 2.5 years, and in 2.5 years, Damien Voss had occupied that corner booth on both nights without variation. She knew without asking. Black coffee, no sugar, brought before he asked for it. A glass of still water. The menu placed in front of him out of courtesy, even though he always ordered the same thing. The branzino when it was fresh, the veal when it wasn't. He ate without theater, paid in cash that was always exact to the last dollar, plus a tip that never varied by more than 2%, regardless of how long the night ran, and he spoke less than anyone she had ever served. But he listened. That was the thing she had noticed about Damien Voss that nobody else seemed to have caught, or maybe they had, and it frightened them. When she spoke, when she said anything at all, even something functional, like kitchen's running about 8 minutes on the fish tonight, he actually heard her. He didn't look through her. He didn't check his phone. He turned his attention toward her with the full weight of it, and it was a substantial weight. and it made her feel simultaneously seen and terrified because she had not been built to withstand being seen. She poured his coffee before he could signal for it. He looked up. "Rough night," he said. It wasn't a question. Clara set the carafe back on the tray. "Every night's a rough night. Some of them just have better lighting." Something shifted in his face. Not a smile. Damien Voss did not smile the way other men smiled. It was more like the slight relaxation of a tension he carried constantly, a momentary decrease in whatever internal pressure he was always running against. It lasted about 1 second, and then it was gone. "Sit down," he said. "I'm working." For 30 seconds. "Sit down." She didn't. She never did. But she stayed standing at the edge of the booth instead of moving away, which was its own kind of compromise, and she said, "You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't." "You want me to have Bertolini hold the fish until you've had the coffee?" "Yes." "Done." She picked up the tray. "Don't read your phone while you're eating. It makes your jaw tight." She walked away before he could respond, and she didn't look back, because looking back was how you lost ground you didn't have to spare. At the service station, Gina Rallo was refilling a breadbasket and watching Clara with the particular kind of smirk that Gina deployed the way other people deployed weaponry, casual, targeted, and with plausible deniability built in. Gina was 24, narrow-hipped, and had the social intelligence of someone who understood that cruelty organized into a group was almost never punished. "He asked you to sit again?" "He asked me to check on his order." "Sure he did." Gina's smirk widened. "Must be a daddy thing, or maybe he just likes his women with more to hold on to." She said it quietly enough that only Clara could hear, but the woman refilling waters 2 feet away definitely caught it, because she turned just slightly toward the sound and then back again, which was the move of someone who had heard and decided they were not involved. Clara set down the tray with more control than she felt. She had 2 responses available to her. She had learned them both and practiced them both, and neither of them ever actually changed anything. One was to say nothing, swallow it, keep moving. The other was to say something sharp back, which would result in Gina going to Enzo with a version of events that somehow turned the original insult into Clara's aggression. She had made the mistake of the second option twice in 2 years. The first time had cost her a Saturday shift. The second time had cost her a formal warning in her file. She said nothing. She went back to her tables. The night ran hard for the next hour. 2 large parties came in close together and backed up the kitchen, and Clara ran plates and managed complaints and refilled waters and did the math in her head the way she always did. Rent was 43 days overdue. The payment arrangement with the hospital billing department required her to hit a minimum of $200 every 30 days, or the account went back to collections, and she was $60 short with 3 days left in the month. Her mother's prescription costs had gone up again. The back of her neck felt like someone was pressing a thumb into the base of her skull. She was carrying a full tray, 4 entrees, 2 of them hot, the pasta threatening to slide on the uneven surface, when Marcus Calder stepped into the trattoria. She didn't know who he was, not yet. She would learn later that Marcus Calder was 26 years old, the youngest son of Vincent Calder, and that he had the kind of confidence that came from never having faced any real consequence in his life. He walked in with 3 other men, all of them loud in that particular way that announced itself before the door fully opened, and he stopped when he saw the corner booth. She saw him see Damien. Something passed over Marcus Calder's face. Amusement or contempt, or the performance of contempt for the benefit of his companions. He said something to the man on his right, and the man laughed, and then Marcus turned and his eyes moved across the room with the bored survey of someone who owned everything in his sightline and found it beneath him. They landed on Clara. She was 3 feet away, tray balanced on her forearm, trying to angle around the group toward table 9. Marcus stepped directly into her path. Not aggressively. That was the thing about men like him. They never did it aggressively. They did it with a smile that made you feel like the obstacle was somehow yours. "Hey," he said. "Sweetheart, we need a table. Host stand is at the front. Someone will seat you." "I'm asking you." "I'm carrying 4 entrees," Clara said. "I'll send someone over." 4 entrees. Marcus looked at the tray with exaggerated concern, then at the men beside him. "She's going to drop that. You see how she's holding it? The tray's already tilting." It wasn't. The tray was level. Clara had been balancing trays for 6 years. "Sir, I need to—" "No, seriously." Marcus stepped closer, not threatening, just crowding. "Let me help, before you make a mess." And he reached out, not for the tray, but for her arm, a touch that was light enough to be deniable and pointed enough to be deliberate. And the motion shifted Clara's balance by exactly the wrong amount at exactly the wrong moment, and the tray tipped. It happened in less than 2 seconds. The pasta came down first, across the front of her uniform. One of the entrees caught the edge of a chair and shattered. The other hit the floor and sent sauce in a wide arc across the tile. Clara caught herself against the nearest table with one hand. The empty plates had gone down too, one of them breaking. And she was upright, she hadn't fallen, but the damage was done, and the room had gone to a specific kind of quiet that was worse than noise. Marcus Calder looked at the mess on the floor, and then at Clara, and then he laughed. Not a cruel laugh. That was almost worse. It was a genuine laugh, easy and untroubled, the laugh of a man for whom the moment was simply funny. A large woman covered in pasta sauce, embarrassed in front of a full restaurant. His companions followed immediately, reflexive and obedient. And around them, the room did the thing that rooms did. Some people looked away, some people watched, and nobody moved, because nobody knew whose business this was except the people already involved in it. Clara stood in the wreckage of 4 entrees and felt the heat move up from her chest to her throat, and she thought, with the exhausted clarity of someone who had rehearsed this moment in 100 different versions over 100 different humiliations, "I'm not going to cry. Not here. Not in front of him." She wasn't sure which him she meant. Enzo appeared from somewhere. He always appeared when there was a scene, with the timing of a man who monitored his restaurant the way a general monitored a battlefield. And he looked at the broken plates and the ruined food, and then at Clara with an expression that contained no sympathy whatsoever. "Get this cleaned up," he said, quietly. That was how Enzo delivered reprimands, quietly, so they couldn't be called out, only absorbed. "And get their table set up, east wall." He knocked the tray, Clara said. "Clara." He put his hand on my arm and... "Clara." His voice dropped another register. "Not now." She picked up the broken pieces from the floor. She could feel people watching her do it. She kept her head down and her breathing steady, and she thought about the $60 she still needed and the prescription and the back of her neck, and she made herself small and functional, and she did not look up, which was why she didn't see Damien Voss stand up from the corner booth. She heard it, though, the scrape of the chair, the particular quality of silence that moved through the room in a wave from the east wall outward, rippling across the tables the way a stone rippled water. And by the time it reached her, she was already looking up. Damien was standing at the edge of the corner booth. He wasn't moving fast. He wasn't moving with any kind of theater. He was simply standing, and the effect was the same as a temperature drop. Immediate, involuntary, and felt by everyone in the room simultaneously. Marcus Calder had gone very still. Damien walked toward the center of the floor with the measured pace of a man who had never once in his adult life needed to hurry to make a point. He stopped 4 feet from Marcus, and he looked at him for a long moment without speaking, and the silence between them was the loudest thing in the restaurant. Then he looked down at Clara, still crouched on the floor with broken pieces in her hands, and something happened in his face that she had never seen there before. Something that was not cold. Something that was almost unbearable in its directness. He crouched down beside her. Damien Voss, in his dark suit, in the middle of Enzo's trattoria, on his knees on the tile floor, picking up pieces of broken plate alongside a waitress covered in pasta sauce. Nobody in the room breathed. "I've got it," Clara said, low, urgent, mortified. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said. His voice was quiet. Not gentle exactly. It wasn't a gentle voice, but it was directed at her with a precision that excluded everything else in the room. "Hand me the big pieces." She handed him the big pieces. He set them in the bus tub she'd pulled close. He stood up first, and then he held out his hand, and she looked at it for a moment. The hand of the most dangerous man in the borough, extended to help her off the floor of a restaurant. And she took it, and he steadied her as she stood. Then he turned to Marcus Calder. Marcus had been watching this with an expression that had moved through several phases. Amusement, confusion, the beginning of uncertainty. He still had 3 men at his back. He still had the posture of someone who had never been wrong in a room. "You know who I am," Damien said. It was not a question. Marcus Calder's jaw moved. "I know who you are." "Then you know," Damien said, his voice dropping to something that wasn't quite a threat yet and was considerably worse for not being one, that what I'm about to tell you is not negotiable. He did not shout. He did not gesture. The room had gone so quiet that Clara could hear the kitchen sounds from behind the closed service door, distant and separate, belonging to a different world. You're going to apologize to her, Damien said. You're going to do it now in front of every person in this building. And then you're going to walk out that door and you're going to tell your father that tonight was a misunderstanding, because that's the only version of tonight that ends without consequences you are not prepared for. Marcus Calder looked around the room. He looked at his companions. He looked at Enzo, who had gone still against the bar with the expression of a man who was mentally reviewing his insurance policy. He looked at Clara. She watched him decide. She watched the exact moment when ego lost the argument with survival instinct, and she watched him swallow it with the particular ugliness of a man who had never swallowed anything in his life. I'm sorry, Marcus said. Flat, barely voiced. Say her name, Damien said. A beat of silence so sharp it had edges. I don't know her name. Then ask. Another beat. Marcus Calder looked at Clara with an expression she couldn't quite classify. Somewhere between contempt and a dawning reluctant discomfort, as though something was occurring to him for the first time. What's your name? He asked. Clara, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. I'm sorry, Clara, Marcus Calder said. It didn't fix anything. An apology extracted under the threat of a man like Damien Voss was not an apology in any meaningful sense. It was a performance of compliance, and everyone in the room understood that, including Clara. But she was standing upright. She had not cried. And the man who had treated her like a punchline was standing in front of her with the particular hollowness of someone who had just lost something they hadn't known they were carrying. Marcus left. His companions followed. The door closed behind them with a sound that felt like a period at the end of a sentence. The room exhaled. Enzo started moving and talking, managing the aftermath the way he managed everything, by directing attention elsewhere and pretending the disruption was already historical. Clara stood with the bus tub in her hands and her uniform stained and her back still aching and the $60 still missing from her life. And she looked at Damien Voss, who was already moving back toward the corner booth, already rearranging himself into the composed, contained man that the room expected him to be. She followed him. She didn't think about it. She just followed him to the corner booth and stood at the edge of it and said, "You didn't have to do that." He sat down. He picked up his coffee, which had gone cold. I know. It's going to make things harder for you with his family. Probably. So why, Clara? He said her name the same way she'd said it when Marcus asked, straightforward, like it was just a word and also like it was specifically hers. Go finish your shift. She stood there for another moment. She wanted to say something that had weight to it, something that matched what he'd done, but she didn't have that language available, and she understood somehow that he didn't need her to. She went back to work. She didn't know, as she moved through the rest of the evening, that Marcus Calder had pulled out his phone before he'd even reached the end of the block. She didn't know what he'd said to his father. She didn't know that by midnight the word had moved through 3 different networks, and that a man named Vincent Calder had listened to the account of his son's humiliation with the particular stillness of someone who did not yet know what to do with what he was feeling, but understood with complete certainty that something would have to be done. And she didn't know, couldn't have known, that when her shift ended at 11 and she walked out the back door into the rain, there were already 2 men across the street who did not work for Damien Voss and were not there by accident. She walked 3 blocks toward the subway before she noticed the car. It was moving too slowly. That was the thing. Not fast, not aggressive, just present in the way that cars usually weren't when you were on foot in the rain on a Thursday night with nobody around. She registered it at the edge of her attention, and then she registered it again, and the second registration was the one that moved through her spine like cold water. She stopped walking. The car stopped. The rain hammered the sidewalk around her, and somewhere behind her, a restaurant full of people had no idea she was standing on a wet corner in the Bronx with a parking lamp throwing her shadow in 4 directions, and a car at the curb that was not moving, and she thought, with a clarity that was almost supernatural in its simplicity, this is because of him. This is already because of him. Her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She answered it because she was Clara Whitmore, and she had been answering calls from unknown numbers her entire life. Debt collectors, hospital billing, her mother's doctors, and the reflex was older than the fear. "Don't go to the subway," said a voice she recognized. Low, controlled, the voice of a man who did not repeat himself. "There's a black car 2 buildings north of your position. Get in it." "That's not—" She stopped, recalibrated. "How do you know where I am?" "Because I had someone watching you leave," Damien Voss said, and paused, and then said something she was not prepared for. "I made you a target tonight. That's on me. But the next 12 hours are going to determine whether this gets worse or manageable, and right now I need you somewhere I can control. Will you get in the car?" She looked at the car across the street, the one that was not moving. She looked at the car 2 buildings north. She thought about the $60, the prescription, the back of her neck. She thought about a man in a dark suit crouching on a restaurant floor picking up pieces of broken ceramic alongside her without being asked, without making it about himself, without wanting anything from the gesture except that it be done. Her thumb found the lock on her phone. "What happens," she said, "if I say no?" The silence lasted exactly long enough to tell her that he'd already thought about this answer. "Then I have someone follow you home to make sure you get there safe, and tomorrow morning you wake up and the world looks exactly the way it did this morning, except worse." Another pause. "Or you get in the car." Clara Whitmore looked up at the rain falling through the yellow light of the parking lamp. She thought about invisible. She thought about disappearing. She thought about being the woman who never asked for anything and never got anything and made herself small enough that the world forgot she was there. She started walking toward the car 2 buildings north. She did not know, as she reached for the door handle, that the vehicle across the street had already begun moving. Slowly, deliberately, the way a threat moves when it is in no hurry because it believes it has already won. She did not know that the driver of that car had already called Vincent Calder to say that the woman was on the street, unprotected, available. She did not know that Damien Voss had already made a decision that would cost him everything he'd spent 15 years building. She opened the door and got in, and the city closed around her like a fist. The car smelled like leather and cigarette smoke that someone had tried to cover with something synthetic and failed. Clara sat in the back seat with her hands in her lap, and her uniform still stained and her hair coming loose from the pin at the back of her neck. And she watched the Bronx move past the window at a speed that felt deliberately unhurried, as though the driver understood that urgency was its own kind of information and had decided not to give any away. There were 2 men in the front. Neither of them spoke to her. Neither of them looked at her through the mirror more than once, and that single glance had been professional rather than personal, the kind of look that cataloged and moved on. She had been assessed and filed, and that was the end of their interest in her, which under different circumstances might have bothered her, and under these circumstances was the closest thing to comfort available. Her phone was in her hand. She had Damien's unknown number still on the screen. She typed, "Where are we going?" The response came back in under 10 seconds. "Somewhere safe. Don't use that number again after tonight." She stared at the message. Then she locked the phone and put it in her pocket and looked back out the window and thought about what safe meant to a man like Damien Voss, and whether it was the same word she had grown up using. They drove for 22 minutes. She counted because counting was the only thing she could do with her hands that didn't feel like panic. The car crossed into a neighborhood she recognized loosely, the edge of Riverdale, where the streets widened and the buildings stopped crowding each other and the trees were old enough to have opinions. They stopped in front of a brownstone that was 3 stories and unremarkable from the outside in the specific way that expensive things were sometimes unremarkable from the outside, as though the people inside had decided that the best security was indifference. The driver got out, opened her door, said nothing. Clara got out of the car and stood on the wet sidewalk and looked at the brownstone and then at the driver, who was already moving toward the front steps with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this particular errand many times and found it neither interesting nor troubling. She followed him inside. The interior was nothing like she'd expected, which meant she realized immediately that she had been expecting something, some confirmation of the image she carried of what Damien Voss's world looked like up close. She'd expected dark wood and heavy curtains and the accumulated weight of money trying to announce itself. What she found instead was a space that was clean and spare and almost aggressively functional. Good furniture, but nothing theatrical. bookshelves that looked used rather than decorative, a kitchen visible through a doorway that had actual food on the counter, not the kind of staged abundance that rich people sometimes performed, but the practical disorder of someone who actually cooked and didn't always have time to finish cleaning up. A woman was sitting at the kitchen table. She was 60, maybe 65, with close-cropped silver hair and the posture of someone who had once been told to sit up straight and had internalized it so completely that it had become structural. She looked up when Clara entered, and her expression did the thing that expressions rarely did when they landed on Clara. It did not perform neutrality over an initial reaction. It was just neutral, genuinely, efficiently neutral. The look of a professional who had been briefed and was proceeding accordingly. "Clara Whitmore," the woman said. Not a question. "Yes. I'm Renata. I work for Mr. Voss. Sit down." Clara sat at the kitchen table because there was no version of the next 30 seconds in which she didn't, and she watched Renata pour 2 cups of coffee with the unhurried competence of someone who did not consider this a social gesture. "You're not hurt," Renata said. Also not a question. No. Good." Renata set a cup in front of her. "There are clothes in the room at the top of the stairs. Second door, your size. You can change. He'll be here in 40 minutes. Clara wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. The warmth was almost violent against her palms. "He's coming here?" "Yes." "Why didn't he just... Why the car? Why not just meet me somewhere? Or... Because the car across the street from you was Vincent Calder's," Renata said, with the flat delivery of someone who had long since stopped softening information before delivering it. "And because Mr. Voss does not meet people in unsecured locations when Vincent Calder has people on the street." She sat down across from Clara. "Drink the coffee. Change your clothes. He'll explain the rest." Clara drank the coffee. She went upstairs and found the second door and opened it onto a room that was small and clean and had clothes laid out on the bed with a precision that suggested Renata had done this before the car had even picked Clara up, which meant Damien had made this decision before she'd answered his call, which meant something about tonight had been anticipated in ways she didn't yet understand. The clothes fit. That was its own unsettling thing, the fact that someone had known her size and acted on that knowledge without her awareness. She stood in front of the small mirror on the back of the door, in dark jeans and a gray sweater that was soft in the way that expensive things were soft without advertising it, and she looked at her own face and tried to find something in it that explained why any of this was happening to her. She found nothing. Her face was just her face. She went back downstairs. Damien arrived in 38 minutes, not 40. He came through the front door without knocking, which told her this was his building or close enough to his that the distinction didn't matter. He was still in the suit from the restaurant, but the jacket was gone and the sleeves were rolled to the forearm, and he had the look of a man who had spent the last 38 minutes in motion, not frantic motion, but the relentless directed kind, the kind that didn't show in the face, but lived in the set of the shoulders and the way the eyes moved when they first entered a room, cataloging before settling. They settled on Clara. "You changed," he said. Renata suggested it. "Good." He moved into the kitchen, poured himself coffee without sitting down, drank half of it standing at the counter, set the cup down. Then he turned and looked at her and said, "I need to tell you some things. Some of them are going to be difficult to hear." Clara looked at him across the kitchen table. "I've been hearing difficult things my whole life." "Go ahead." Something crossed his face at that. She couldn't name it exactly. It wasn't pity. She'd have recognized pity and walked out. It was closer to recognition, which was its own uncomfortable thing. He sat down. "Vincent Calder runs the east side of a distribution network that my organization and 3 others have a financial interest in," he said. He spoke the way he always spoke, direct, without decoration, with the particular economy of someone who had learned that extra words were extra liability. "We have an arrangement. Not a friendship. An arrangement. Tonight his son came into my restaurant and put his hands on someone under my roof. I'm not under your roof. I'm an employee of Enzo's. You're under my roof when you're in a room where I'm sitting," Damien said. Not arrogant, just factual, in the way that geography was factual. Marcus Calder knows that. His father knows that. The public apology I extracted tonight was a message, and Vincent received it. "What kind of message?" "That I won't negotiate the dignity of people in my space. even when doing so is inconvenient. Clara looked at her coffee cup. And now Vincent Calder has a car on my street. Had. Past tense, it's gone. Because you moved me. Because I moved you. She looked up. And what happens tomorrow when I go back to my apartment? When I go back to work? The car just doesn't come back? Damien was quiet for a moment. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, rain continued its argument with the city. That, he said, is what we need to talk about. Before he could continue, Renata appeared in the kitchen doorway with her phone in her hand and an expression that Clara was already learning to read. Not alarm exactly, but the predecessor to alarm, the tightening around the eyes that preceded information that required action. He's calling, Renata said. She held out the phone. Damien didn't move immediately. He looked at Clara for one more second, as though finishing a thought he hadn't yet spoken, and then he stood and took the phone and walked out of the kitchen. Clara heard his footsteps go toward the front of the building, heard a door close, and then heard nothing. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at Renata. Vincent Calder, Clara said. Yes. He's calling to... I don't speculate, Renata said. She refilled her own coffee and sat back down and picked up a small tablet from the edge of the table and began reading something on it. You should eat something. There's bread on the counter. Clara ate bread and did not ask more questions and listened to the silence from the front room and thought about her apartment, where the window in the bedroom didn't close all the way, and she'd been meaning to fix it for 3 months, and somehow 3 months had become a year, and thought about whether any of the things she'd been meaning to do for a year still applied to her life, in the same way they had this morning. Damien came back into the kitchen 14 minutes later. He set the phone on the table. He stood with his hands flat on the counter for a moment with his back to her, and she watched the muscles across his shoulders do something she couldn't quite classify. Tension that was working to become decision. He turned around. Vincent wants to meet, he said. Tomorrow. About tonight. About tonight. About the arrangement. About several things that have been building for longer than tonight. He picked up his coffee cup. It was empty. He set it back down without going for the pot. He's going to want something from me in exchange for letting tonight become the end of it. What kind of something? I don't know yet. That's what concerns me. Clara looked at him carefully. She had the feeling of watching a man do math in real time. Not simple math, but the kind with multiple variables that shifted value depending on what you prioritized. She recognized the feeling because she did it herself, every month, with numbers that were less abstract and no less consequential. Does it involve me? She asked. The pause was its own answer. It might. How? Clara, tell me. I'm not going to sit in this kitchen eating bread while men in other rooms decide what my life looks like. How does it involve me? He looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down and leaned forward with his forearms on the table. And for the first time since she'd met him, she had the sense of a man who was closer to the surface than he preferred to be. Not vulnerable exactly, but present in a way that cost him something. The Calder family has been looking for a way to reframe the arrangement for 6 months, he said. They want a larger percentage of the East Side revenue. I've refused twice. What happened tonight, Marcus coming in, the scene he made, it wasn't random. Vincent doesn't have random children. Claire absorbed this. He sent his son to provoke you, to demonstrate that I have something to lose, which I didn't until... He stopped. Something moved across his face that he pulled back before it finished arriving. The message was that my position has a vulnerability. They were looking for what it was. And I'm it. He didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. The answer was already in the geometry of the room, a woman sitting in his kitchen, in his clothes, in his building, at 11:30 at night, because he'd moved her here to keep her safe, and every person who needed to know that already knew it. You're not a vulnerability, he said. You're a person. That's not the same thing. In your world, it might be. In every world, people use what other people value to get what they want. That's not my world specifically. That's just the world. He held her gaze. I'm telling you this because you have a right to know what tonight actually was, and because what comes next is going to require you to make some decisions. What kind of decisions? Whether you want my protection, formally. She looked at him. What does that mean formally? The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a car passed on the wet street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling through the window above the sink, and then the dark came back. "It means you move," he said. "Not permanently. For a period of time, until the situation resolves. It means you're not in your apartment, not on that block, not walking to the subway alone. It means people know you're connected to me in a way that makes you untouchable. Or a target. You're already a target. Tonight made that happen regardless of what you decide now. The only question is whether you're an unprotected target or a protected one." Clara set her hands flat on the table. She could hear her own pulse, not in her ears, in her hands, the slow, insistent pressure of blood moving through her body with complete indifference to the complexity of her situation. Her body was doing what it always did, continuing, regardless. "I have a job," she said. "I'll handle Enzo. I have an apartment. I'll cover it. I have a mother. She needs. Tell me what she needs." The directness of it caught her off guard. She had been waiting for the part where the offer narrowed, where the conditions appeared, where what was being given turned out to be balanced by what was being taken. She had grown up in a world where help always had a mechanism, visible or not, and the mechanism was always eventually revealed, and it always cost more than the help was worth. She looked at him. "Why?" she said. He didn't pretend not to understand the question. "Because I made you a target, and because—" He stopped. The pause was different from his other pauses, shorter but denser. "Because you talked to me like a person for 2 years when everyone else in that restaurant talked to me like something to be managed or feared. And I didn't do anything about it then because it wasn't my place. But tonight it became my place." It was the longest thing she had ever heard him say about himself. She didn't know what to do with it. She filed it somewhere she could examine it later and said, "1 month. I'll do 1 month. After that, I reassess. That's reasonable. And I want to know what happens at the meeting with Vincent Calder, within what I'm able to tell you. That's not good enough. That's what I'm able to offer." She held his gaze for another 3 seconds. Then she nodded. She went to bed in the small, clean room upstairs and lay on her back with her eyes on the ceiling and listened to the building settle around her and thought about a life that had, in the space of one Thursday evening, become something she didn't recognize, and tried to decide whether that was better or worse than the life she'd been living before, which she had also not entirely recognized, but had at least had time to develop a working relationship with. She slept eventually in the fitful, disconnected way of someone whose body had decided that rest was non-negotiable, regardless of what the mind was doing. She woke once at 3:30 to the sound of voices below. Damien and Renata, she thought, though she couldn't make out words, and then fell back under before she could listen long enough to be frightened by what she didn't catch. In the morning, Renata made eggs and said very little, and the sun was out for the first time in 4 days, which Clara thought should have felt like something and mostly just felt like information. Damien was already gone. He came back at noon. He came through the front door with the same compressed energy as the night before, but tighter, closer to the surface, and Renata looked up from the tablet and looked at him and said simply, "How bad?" "Manageable," he said. Then he looked at Clara, who was sitting in the living room with a book she'd taken from the shelf and not been reading, and he said, "Come in here," and went into the kitchen. She followed. He stood at the counter. He did not sit down this time. "Vincent wants the Northeast Corridor, 15% above current rate. He's framing it as a goodwill adjustment after last night. What he means is he wants to demonstrate that his son's humiliation had a cost, and if you say no, he escalates, operationally. Probably starting with supply chain interference, slowing product, redirecting it, creating shortfalls that cost everyone money, and create pressure on my other partners to reconsider the arrangement." He crossed his arms. Not defensively. It was a thinking posture, weight shifted, jaw working slightly. He's patient. He's been building this case for 6 months. Last night accelerated his timeline, but it didn't change his strategy. "So what do you do?" "I'm still deciding." "What are your options?" He looked at her. "Why?" She set the unread book on the counter. "Because you said I have a right to know what tonight was. Last night was tonight, 12 hours ago. I still have the right." Something in his expression shifted, not softened exactly, but changed in the way that shifts in foundation change the look of everything built on top of it. He had not, she understood, spoken to many people about the actual content of the decisions he made. He had people who executed decisions. He had Renata, who managed the logistics of decisions. He did not, as far as she could tell, have anyone who sat across from him in a kitchen and asked him to walk through the reasoning before the decision was made. Option 1, he said. I give Vincent what he's asking for, the 15%. It settles the immediate situation, loses me money and positioning, and tells every other partner that I can be pressured through personal associations. So not that. Not that. Option 2, I counter. Offer 5% as a face-saving gesture, frame it as a voluntary correction, make it look like his move. It might hold for 6 months. And option 3, the silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the ones she'd learned to read from him. Heavier, more deliberate. The kind that preceded something he'd already decided and was figuring out how to say. Option 3 is I call Vincent's bluff by going over him. There are 2 other family heads withstanding in this arrangement. If I bring both of them to the table and make it clear that the existing percentages are fixed by consensus rather than bilateral negotiation, Vincent loses the leverage to threaten me unilaterally. He can't escalate without their approval. He won't get it. That sounds like the right option. It is. It's also the option that takes 3 weeks minimum to arrange, requires me to make commitments to the other families that I would prefer not to make, and gives Vincent 3 weeks to do something unpredictable. He looked at her steadily. Which brings me back to you. Clara waited. During those 3 weeks, he said, Vincent is going to look for pressure points. You are a pressure point. I need you somewhere he can't reach you, and I need you to stay there without feeling like I've taken something from you to do it. She heard what was underneath that sentence, the fact that he had thought about what it would feel like to her, that he'd considered it separate from the operational calculus, not as a variable, but as a thing that mattered independent of its strategic value. You've thought about this a lot, she said, since approximately 9:47 last night. That's when the car stopped outside. That's when I knew it wasn't random. She looked at him. He looked back. The kitchen around them was ordinary. The refrigerator's hum, the morning light through the window above the sink, the smell of coffee still in the air from breakfast. None of it mapped onto the conversation they were having. She had that feeling again of her life being a container that had, overnight, been asked to hold something with completely different properties than what it had been designed for. 3 weeks, she said. Probably 3 weeks. And then? And then the situation is resolved and you can go back to... He stopped. Something went through his face, brief and unguarded, and she caught it before he could retrieve it. Something that looked like the beginning of a sentence he wasn't prepared to finish honestly. Back to what? She asked. He didn't answer. That was the moment she understood that the situation might resolve itself in 3 weeks. But something else. Something that had been accumulating for 2.5 years of Tuesday and Thursday evenings in a corner booth was not going to resolve itself on anyone's timeline, and that understanding sat between them in the kitchen like a third person, acknowledged by neither and impossible for either to ignore. She was about to say something, she wasn't sure what, something practical, something that would give them both an exit from the moment, when Renata walked in with her phone extended. It's Marcus, she said. Damien's face did not change. That was the frightening thing. It simply went flat, the way a surface went flat when pressure was applied from underneath. Everything still but the stillness itself, carrying information. Why is Marcus calling this number? Damien said. It was not addressed to Renata. He said his father doesn't know. He said he needs to talk to you before the meeting. Damien took the phone. He looked at it for one moment. Then he looked at Clara and said, Go upstairs. Damien? Now Clara. Not harsh, but absolute, in the way that absolutes sometimes were. Not a wall, but a foundation, something that was what it was regardless of how you felt about it. Please. She went upstairs. She stood in the hallway at the top of the stairs, and she could hear his voice from the kitchen below, low and controlled, and she could not make out words, but she could hear the cadence, the particular way his voice moved when something surprised him, the slight increase in pace that was the only tell he had. She heard him say no, clear enough to catch even through the floor. She heard him say it again, then silence, then footsteps, and the sound of the kitchen door opening, and Renata's voice saying something in Italian that Clara didn't catch, and then more silence that was different from all the previous silences. Denser, pressurized, the kind of quiet that happened in the seconds before something structural gave way. She was still standing in the hallway when Damien appeared at the bottom of the stairs. He looked up at her. His face had done the things she'd never seen it do before. Not in 2.5 years of Tuesdays and Thursdays, not in the restaurant last night, not in the kitchen this morning. It had lost the composure, not dramatically, not in the way of someone falling apart, but the way a current lost voltage, present, functioning, but reduced, running on something less than full capacity. Marcus didn't come into the restaurant on his father's orders, he said. Clara looked at him. He came because someone inside my organization told him I was there, told him the night and the time and who I'd be watching. He paused. Someone told Marcus Calder that the waitress in the corner booth meant something to me, before I knew it myself. The hallway was very quiet. That means, Clara said, and her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect it to be, that whoever told him is still inside, Damien said. Yes. He stood at the bottom of the stairs, and she stood at the top, and between them was the weight of everything that sentence meant. That the danger was not outside the building, not across the street, not in a car driving through the Bronx. It was somewhere closer. It was something already trusted. It was a wound already inside the body, quiet and hidden, and no one yet knew whose hands had made it. He came up the stairs. Not fast. Damien Voss did not do things fast when fast would look like panic, but with a deliberateness that was its own kind of urgency. And when he reached the top and stood in the hallway 3 feet from where Clara was standing, she could see it in the way he held himself, the controlled stillness of a man whose internal architecture was sustaining a load it had not been designed for. Come downstairs, he said. Tell me here. He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. Not reluctance, but the brief calculation of a man deciding how much truth the next 30 seconds could hold. He made the decision the way he made all decisions. Quickly, completely, without visible revision. Marcus said the tip came from inside my operation. Someone with access to my schedule, my location patterns, my personal associations. The last 2 words came out with a flatness that told her he found them inadequate and had used them anyway because the alternatives were worse. He says his father didn't authorize the restaurant. Vincent is running his own play, but Marcus walking into Enzo's that night was someone else's move. Who? That's what I need to find out. How many people have access to that kind of information? 4, maybe 5, depending on how recent the leak is. He said it without expression, but she watched his jaw set on the last word. Set and release once, like something being tested and confirmed as solid. She followed him downstairs. Renata was in the kitchen with the tablet face down on the table and her phone in her hand, and the look of someone who had already run the same calculations Damien was running and arrived at conclusions she wasn't ready to speak aloud. She looked up when they came in. She looked at Damien, and then at Clara, and then back at Damien. I've pulled the access logs from the last 2 weeks, she said. Schedule entries, location pings, anything that would have told someone you were at Enzo's Thursday nights. And? 7 people accessed the Thursday rotation in the last month. 4 of them have clearance for personal location data. She set the phone on the table, face up. 4 names on the screen. Clara didn't recognize any of them. Damien looked at the names. He didn't touch the phone. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at the names the way a surgeon might look at an X-ray. Not emotionally, but with a precision that was its own form of feeling. The feeling of a person whose professional identity was built on the ability to read things accurately, and who was confronting the possibility that something had been unreadable to him for longer than he knew. Pull everything, he said. Communications, financials, movement, 48 hours either side of Thursday. Already running. He nodded. He pulled out his own phone and looked at it and put it back in his pocket without doing anything with it, which was the most agitated Clara had seen him. The phone going back into the pocket unused was a man stopping himself from making a move he hadn't fully thought through. The meeting with Vincent, Clara said. Both of them looked at her. It's still happening today. Yes, Damien said. If someone in your organization tipped off Marcus, and if Marcus is now warning you about it, then either Marcus is genuinely trying to help you, or Marcus is the second move in something his father built with your insider's help, and the warning is designed to send you in the wrong direction before the meeting. The kitchen was very quiet. Renata looked at Damien. Damien was already looking at Clara with the expression she'd seen once before. The one that wasn't quite surprised, because he wasn't a man who surprised easily, but was the closest thing to it that his face could produce. "Which is it?" Clara said. "I don't know yet," he said. "That's the problem." She sat down at the table. She put her hands flat on the surface. Her own tell, she realized, the physical act of grounding herself when the ground felt unreliable. And she said, "What time is the meeting?" 2:00. She looked at the clock on the microwave. It was 10:47. "Then you have 3 hours to decide which version of Marcus you're dealing with, and you can't do that from here." She looked at Renata. "Can you cross-reference the 4 names with any financial connection to the Calder family? Anything. Family members, shared business interests, properties?" Renata did not look at Damien for permission. She picked up the tablet. "Give me 20 minutes. "Do it in 15, Damien said. He sat down across from Clara. He sat the way he always sat, with the weight of himself fully committed to the chair, nothing provisional about his posture. But there was something different in it today that she placed after a moment. He was tired. Not sleepy. Tired in the deeper register, the kind that sleep didn't fix because it wasn't built from sleep deprivation, but from years of sustained vigilance, of trusting carefully and being careful about what you trusted and doing the mathematics of loyalty every single day, and knowing that the mathematics was always eventually wrong about someone. "You've done this before," Clara said. Had someone turn. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. "Once, 12 years ago, a man named Sutter, who'd been with my father before me." He said it without effect, the way people said things they had worked very hard to file correctly. He was passing information to a competitor for 8 months before we found out. We didn't find out because we caught him. We found out because the competitor made a move using information that only Sutter could have provided. And the move cost 3 people their livelihoods, and 1 person considerably more than that. Clara heard what was in the space around the last phrase. She didn't ask him to fill it. "After that," he said, "I restructured everything, compartmentalized the information access, built-in verification layers, made it so that no single person had enough pieces to do real damage without being traceable." He looked at his hands on the table. "Someone found a way through it anyway, which means they've been patient and smart and present long enough to understand the system, which narrows it. Yes. Someone who's been with you long enough to learn the compartments. Yes." He looked up. She looked back at him. The kitchen light was ordinary and flat, and it made him look older than he did in the restaurant, where the lighting was warm and strategic. Here he looked like what he actually was. A man in his 40s who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had recently been informed that something he'd relied on to help distribute the weight had been quietly working against him. Renata came back into the kitchen in 11 minutes, not 15 or 20. She set the tablet on the table between them, and her face had done the thing it didn't usually do. It had acquired an expression, a specific one, the expression of someone who has found what they were looking for and wishes they hadn't. "Caruso," she said. Damien went very still. Renata put her finger on the tablet. "Leo Caruso's daughter, married name DiPietro. She owns 40% of a property management company in Pelham. The company's other major stakeholder, through 2 shell entities, traces back to a holding group that Vincent Calder's brother-in-law incorporated in 2019. The name Leo Caruso sat in the kitchen like a dropped temperature. Clara didn't know the name, but she could read the room, and the room had changed in the way that rooms changed when a specific kind of information entered them. Not dramatically, but completely. The way the quality of light changed when a cloud moved across the sun. Everything was the same, and everything was different, and the difference was in how you understood what you'd been seeing. "Leo's been with me for 11 years, Damien said. His voice had not changed in volume or cadence. That was the worst part, and it hadn't changed at all. "I know," Renata said. "He was at my father's funeral." "I know." "He was the one who—" Damien stopped. He put the back of his hand against his mouth for one moment, a gesture so brief and private that Clara almost looked away from it. Then it was gone, and his hand was on the table, and his face was the face she knew. "He was the one who told me when I took over that loyalty was the only currency that didn't inflate. He said it to me specifically. Those words. People say things they need to believe," Renata said. quiet, precise. The tone of someone who had learned to deliver unbearable things in bearable packages. "Pull him in," Damien said. "If we pull him before the meeting, Vincent will know we know." "I don't care what Vincent knows." "Damien." Renata's voice had something new in it. Clara had not heard her use his first name before. "If Leo knows we're onto him and the meeting falls apart, Vincent has no reason to hold his other options. We lose the 3-week window. We lose the coalition play. We end up reactive instead of ahead." The refrigerator hummed. A car passed outside. Damien's hands were flat on the table. Clara watched them. She watched the specific stillness of them. The kind of stillness that was not calm, but was the suppression of something that very much wanted to be the opposite of calm. "Let him go to the meeting," Renata said. "Let Leo think he's still invisible. Use what he doesn't know we know." "And what does Leo think he knows?" "He thinks he set the board. He tipped Marcus. Marcus comes in and makes a scene. You react emotionally. Vincent uses your reaction as the basis for the renegotiation. He thinks you're walking into that meeting already destabilized." "He's not wrong," Damien said. "He is wrong," Claire said. They both looked at her. She had not planned to speak. The words had arrived with the same involuntary quality as the decision to get into the car the night before, not thought out, just present, pulled up from somewhere that operated below deliberation. "He thinks you're destabilized because of last night," she said. "Because of the restaurant, the scene, the car outside. He thinks you made an emotional decision, and now you're operating from a compromised position." She kept her eyes on Damien. "But you're not. You know what he doesn't know you know. That's not a compromised position. That's the only position that matters." The kitchen was very quiet. Damien looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Renata. Renata was looking at Clara with the assessment expression, the cataloging look. But this time something had been added to it that hadn't been there before. Not warmth exactly. Renata did not appear to operate in warmth, but a recalibration of some kind. "Set up the meeting," Damien said. "Don't touch Leo. Don't touch anything that might tell him we've moved." Renata nodded and left the kitchen. Damien stayed at the table. He was looking at the tablet but not reading it, she could tell. His eyes were too still, focused on a fixed point that had nothing to do with what was on the screen. She recognized that kind of looking. She did it herself, in the bathroom mirror some mornings before work, staring at a point just past her own reflection, building the necessary architecture to get through whatever the day required. "Leo has a son," Damien said. Not to her exactly, just to the air in front of him. 19 years old, I paid for 2 years of his community college. Clara said nothing. "I don't say that for credit," he said. "I say it because it means the decision Leo made wasn't made in a vacuum. He has people, he has reasons, and whatever those reasons are, they were strong enough to override 11 years. He paused. "I find I want to know what they were, before anything else." "Why?" He looked at her. "Because if I don't understand it, I'll just repeat the conditions that produced it." She held his gaze. He was, she thought, one of the most genuinely isolated people she had ever been in a room with, and she had been in rooms with a great many isolated people because isolation was something she recognized from the inside and could therefore identify in others with a precision that people without that particular experience often lacked. "Go to the meeting," she said. "Do what you need to do. I'll be here." "You don't have to—" "I know I don't have to," she said, giving him his own words back with a deliberateness that was not unkind. "Go." He went. The brownstone was very quiet after he left. Renata moved through it with the focused efficiency of someone running a command operation from a kitchen table, which was essentially what she was doing. 3 phones, the tablet, a legal pad that was filling with notes and a cramped, precise script that Clara couldn't read from across the room. Clara stayed out of her way and found a chair near the window in the front room and watched the street and tried to make her mind do something useful. It didn't. Her mind kept returning to the restaurant, to the moment the tray tipped, to the way the room had gone quiet and the way Damien had stood up from the corner booth with that particular unhurried gravity, and she found herself examining the sequence of events with the unsettled feeling of someone who has just learned that a thing they witnessed was not what they thought it was. Not simpler than what they thought, but more layered, involving machinery that had been running long before the visible moment. Someone inside Damien's operation had told Marcus Calder to go to that restaurant, had told him when to go. had told him, apparently, that there was a waitress in the corner booth who meant something to the man who sat across from her twice a week. She turned that over. Meant something. Past tense, according to Damien. Before I knew it myself, he had said, standing at the bottom of the stairs. She hadn't flagged the tense at the time. She flagged it now, sitting in a chair by the window with the October sun moving across the floor in the slow way that sun moved when you had nothing to do but watch it. And she turned the phrase over until it was worn smooth and still didn't yield anything simple. Renata appeared in the doorway at 12:40. I'm going to the meeting location to set up sight lines. You'll stay here. The door locks from the inside. Don't open it for anyone except Damien or me. You have my number. She paused. Do you have questions? Will he be safe at the meeting? Renata considered this with the seriousness it deserved. He'll have 2 people outside. Vincent will have his own. It's a neutral location. We chose it jointly, which means neither side can use it as a trap without destroying whatever goodwill they're pretending to negotiate in. Another pause. He's done this before. Does that make it safe? It makes it less dangerous than the alternative. She moved toward the front door. There's food in the refrigerator. Don't call him during the meeting. She left. Clara sat in the empty brownstone and listened to it be empty. It was a specific kind of quiet, the quiet of a place built for more activity than it currently held, like a theater between performances. She ate something from the refrigerator standing up at the counter without tasting it, and then she went back to the chair by the window and she waited. The meeting was supposed to take an hour. At 3:15, Damien was not back. At 3:40, she called Renata. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail, and she hung up without leaving a message and sat with the phone in her hand and did not, through an act of will that cost her something real, let herself fill the silence with the worst versions of what it might mean. At 4:03, the front door opened. She was on her feet before she'd made the decision to stand. Damien came through the door, and he was whole, upright, moving under his own direction, no visible damage. But the quality of his movement had changed. The compression she had learned to read in him, the contained forward momentum, was gone. What replaced it was something she didn't have a word for, not in the vocabulary of how she'd understood him until now. He moved like a man who had been handed something he hadn't expected to have to carry and was still working out the weight distribution. He saw her standing in the middle of the room, and he stopped. "Tell me," she said. He came in. He sat on the arm of the chair by the window. Not in it, on the arm, like a man who couldn't fully commit to the posture of rest. He put his forearms on his knees and his hands loose between them, and he looked at the floor for a moment. "Vincent didn't come," he said. She waited. "He sent his lawyer and a letter." Damien's voice was flat in the specific way of someone reading from an internal document they had already memorized. The letter outlines his position on the Northeast Corridor renegotiation. It's no longer 15%. He wants full operational control of the Northeast distribution by the end of the month. Not a percentage, control. Clara sat down on the coffee table across from him. That's completely different from, it's a different demand, yes. He escalated overnight. Why? Damien looked up. His eyes were steady, but there was something behind them that hadn't been there this morning. Something that had been delivered to him in a room that afternoon, and that he was now carrying back into this house, whether he wanted to or not. "Because he knows about Leo," he said. The room went very still. Vincent's lawyer delivered a second document, a financial audit, detailed, current, and accurate, of 3 of my Northeast accounts. Information that would require access to internal records that only Leo handles. He paused. Leo didn't just tip off Marcus. He's been feeding Vincent operational data for months. The accounts, the contacts, the supply structure. Vincent doesn't want a percentage of my Northeast operation. He wants it because he already knows everything about it, and he's confident he can absorb it cleanly. Clara heard her own breathing. He played the restaurant as the opening move, Damien said. Not to destabilize me emotionally, to give himself a documented grievance, his son, publicly humiliated, so that when he made the move on the Northeast, it looked like fair recompense to the other family heads, a man defending his son's honor, not a hostile acquisition. He looked at his hands. It's elegant. I would have done the same thing. That's not a comfort. No, it's not. She looked at him. She needed to ask the next question, and she was aware asking it that the answer had the potential to change the geometry of everything she thought she understood about the situation she was in. "The coalition play," she said. The other two family heads. "Can you still make the case?" Something crossed his face. Something she hadn't seen yet and would remember for a long time after. A flash of something unguarded, and then the reassertion of control. And in the half-second between those two things, she saw it. He already knew the answer, and the answer was not good. "Vincent met with them this morning," Damien said, "before the 2 o'clock. He used the financial information Leo provided to make the case that my Northeast operation was already structurally compromised, that absorbing it was the cleanest resolution for everyone's interests." Another pause. "One of them is non-committal. The other has already indicated support for Vincent's position." Clara sat on the coffee table in the afternoon light in a brownstone in Riverdale and understood, with the slow clarity of someone watching a structure fail, that the plan, the 3-week window, the coalition, the controlled resolution, was gone. Not delayed. Gone. Dismantled from the inside by someone who had been trusted with the tools to dismantle it and had spent months sharpening them in secret. "What do you have left?" she said. It was not a soft question. She didn't ask it softly. She asked it the way she had learned to ask the hospital billing department about her account. Directly, without flinching, because flinching cost you time and time cost you options. Damien looked at her for a long moment. "I have 12 hours before Vincent files the formal claim with the other families," he said. "After that, it becomes a consensus process, and I'm on defense. If I'm going to do anything, it has to happen before midnight." "What can you do in 12 hours? "I can go to Leo." Clara looked at him. "To do what?" "To ask him," Damien said, quietly. "Before anything else. I told you this morning, I want to understand it before I do anything else. The why. The actual reason." He looked at her, and then, depending on what he says, there may be something salvageable. If Leo is willing to recant, to provide a counter-account to the other families of what Vincent asked him to do and why. If Leo becomes a witness instead of a weapon, the financial documents become evidence of Vincent's manipulation rather than evidence of my vulnerability. Will Leo do that? I don't know. What happens if he won't? Damien was quiet for a moment. The October light had moved across the floor and now lay against the base of the far wall, thin and reddening. "Then I lose the Northeast," he said, "and I spend the next 6 months rebuilding from a position that everyone in this city will know was compromised. And Vincent Calder will have demonstrated to every person watching that the way to take something from Damien Voss is to find the person he trusts most and use them quietly until the time is right." Clara stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the street. The ordinary street. Cars, a woman walking a dog, the sun doing what the sun did without consulting anyone about timing. She stood there for a moment with her back to him, and she thought about what she was going to say before she said it, which was something she did not always have the luxury of. Then she turned around. "I want to come with you," she said. "Absolutely not." "Damien." "Clara." He was on his feet. "Leo is not a safe person to be in a room with right now. Whatever his reasons were, whatever he tells me tonight, the fact of what he did makes him someone who is capable of more than I thought he was. I am not—" He stopped, his jaw set. "I am not taking you into that room. You said I had a right to know what was happening. You know what's happening. I know the information. I don't know if you're going to be okay." She said it without flinching, looking at him across the room with the particular directness of someone who has had enough practice saying difficult, true things that the difficulty is no longer the obstacle. "Those are different things." He looked at her. She looked back. The room held them both in the late afternoon light, and neither of them moved, and the thing that had been sitting between them in the kitchen that morning, the unnamed third presence, the accumulation of 2.5 years and one impossible Thursday night, was fully in the room now, not hovering at the edges, and they both knew it, and neither of them had the available capacity to deal with it alongside everything else, which was perhaps why neither of them looked away. "Stay here," he said finally. "I'll call you when I have him." "You'll call me?" "Yes." "Before you make any decisions." A pause. "Yes." "Damien," She said his name the way she said everything, directly, without inflation. If Leo won't cooperate, if you lose the Northeast, if tonight ends the way it might end, is there something else? Underneath all of it, is there something that doesn't get taken? He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he might not answer. There's this building, he said, and there's Renata. And there are maybe 3 other people in this city whose judgment I still trust. He looked at her. And there's whoever you are to me, which I don't have the right language for yet, and which is an extremely inconvenient thing to be discovering right now. She held that. It sat in her chest with the specific weight of something true. Go, she said. Find Leo. He went. She stood at the window and watched his car pull away from the curb, and then she stood there, after it was gone, watching the empty space where it had been. And she was still standing there 20 minutes later when her phone rang, and the number on the screen was one she didn't recognize. And the voice that came through when she answered was not Damien and not Renata. And it said only 4 words before the line went dead, 4 words in a voice that was low and male and completely without effect, the voice of someone delivering a message they had been paid to deliver and had no personal investment in. The 4 words were, "We already have him." 4 words, and then silence, and then the dial tone, which was somehow worse than the words. Clara stood at the window with the phone against her ear, and the dial tone running through her like a current, and she did not move for 3 full seconds, which was how long it took for her body to process what her mind had already understood. Someone had taken Damien, and the only people who knew he was going to Leo tonight were the people in this building, and Renata was not back yet, and she was alone. She called Renata. 1 ring, 2. Then, I'm 10 minutes out. What? Someone called me. Unknown number. They said we already have him. 4 words. Line went dead. Silence on Renata's end that lasted exactly long enough to tell Clara that Renata understood what those 4 words meant and was deciding how to respond to them in real time. Don't leave the building, Renata said. Lock the kitchen door as well as the front. I'm coming now. Renata, don't leave the building, Clara. The line went dead. Clara locked both doors. She stood in the kitchen with her back against the counter and her hands pressed flat on the tile behind her, and she breathed, deliberately, through her nose, the way she'd learned to breathe on the worst nights of the worst months, when the bills were stacked on the kitchen table and her mother was in the next room and there was no version of the math that worked, and breathing was the only thing that was entirely within her control. She thought about the 4 words, the voice that had said them, male, low, no regional accent she could place, no urgency, no threat beyond the information itself. The voice of someone who wanted her to know, not someone who wanted to frighten her. Which meant the call was not random, which meant the caller had her number and a reason to use it and had made a calculation that she should know. She thought about Marcus. Marcus Calder, who had called the brownstone to warn Damien. Marcus, who according to Damien had said his father didn't know about the call. Marcus, who had initially walked into Enzo's as what she now understood was the opening move of his father's long game, but who had, apparently, developed second thoughts about the specific human being caught in its mechanism. She found the original unknown number, the one Damien had called her from the night before, the one he'd told her not to use again after tonight. She stared at it. Tonight was tonight. The prohibition had not technically expired. She called it. It rang 6 times. She was already composing the words for a voicemail, the tight, controlled sentences of someone leaving a message in a crisis, when the line picked up and a voice said, "This number is—" "I know what this number is," she said. "I need you to tell me where he is, now." A pause, long enough that she thought the line had dropped. Then, "Who is this?" "Clara Whitmore. I was in the restaurant Thursday night. She stopped. She didn't have a word for what she was. She used the only word that had operational weight. "I'm in his building, and someone just called me and told me they have him, and you are the only person I can think of who might know where they would take him." Another pause. Longer this time. "How did you get this number?" "He called me from it last night. I kept it." She pressed her free hand harder against the tile. "Are you going to help me or not?" She heard breathing. She heard, in the background, a television, or maybe traffic, and then the muffling sound of a hand going over the receiver and a muffled exchange she couldn't make out. Then the hand came off, and the voice said, My father has a warehouse in Hunts Point, Old Fish Market, east side of the district, Edgewater Road. He uses it it's where he takes people when he wants to have conversations without documentation. Is that where Damien is? I don't know. I'm telling you where it would be if my father made this move. A pause. I didn't know he was going to do this tonight. I want you to know that. It doesn't change what's happening. No, Marcus Calder said. It doesn't. Another pause, and in it something that might have been the sound of a young man doing a calculation about how much of his father's empire he was willing to burn down before the night was over. There'll be 4 men minimum. My father doesn't go anywhere with fewer. Will Vincent be there? If he wants to do this personally, yes, he'll want to be there. Thank you, Clara said. She hung up. She called Renata back. Renata answered on the first ring. I'm 4 minutes out. Hunts Point, Old Fish Market on Edgewater Road. That's where they have him. Silence. Then, how do you know? Marcus Calder told me. The silence this time had a different texture. You called Marcus Calder. I called the number Damien used last night, Marcus answered. She pushed off from the counter. 4 men minimum. Vincent probably on site personally. Renata's voice, when it came back, was the voice of someone who had made a decision and moved on from making it in the span of a single breath. I'm rerouting. Give me 8 minutes. Do not. I'm coming with you. Clara, he told me to call him before he made any decisions. He didn't call. That means he couldn't call, which means this is already past the decision point, and sitting in this building is not something I'm able to do. She heard her own voice, and it surprised her. Not the words, but the quality of them, the absence of the apologetic undercurrent she'd spent years threading through everything she said as a kind of preemptive tax on her own presence. The undertow was gone. What was underneath it was just her making a statement of fact. I'm coming. Where do I meet you? 8 seconds of silence. Front steps, Renata said. 3 minutes. Renata's car was a dark sedan that looked like nothing and moved like something, and she drove with both hands on the wheel and her eyes forward and the contained focus of a woman for whom this was not the first time she had driven toward a situation that most people would have been driving away from. She handed Clara a phone, not her own, a second one, pulled from the glove compartment. If we're separated, this has 1 number in it. You call it and say the word stable and someone will come to your location. Stable? Clara repeated. Don't use it unless we're separated. If you use it unnecessarily, it compromises the contact. Clara held the phone. How many people can we get to Hunts Point in the next 2? Already moving. Renata changed lanes with a precision that suggested she was counting seconds. They'll be on site before us, establishing sight lines. 4 men, Marcus said. I heard you the first time. They crossed the bridge in silence. The city moved past the windows in the particular way it moved at night when you were traveling through it toward something instead of away. The lights had weight, the streets had direction, and everything peripheral fell away until the windshield and what it framed was the only geography that existed. Hunts Point at night was its own kind of landscape, industrial and indifferent, the streets wide and poorly lit, the buildings blocky and purposeful. The fish market district had its own smell even at this hour, something salt and cold that had seeped into the concrete over decades and become structural. Renata cut the headlights 2 blocks out and rolled the last stretch with only the city's ambient light and the orange sodium glow of the distant highway. She stopped the car in the shadow of a loading dock. The building is half a block east, she said. Single entry on the north face, loading bay on the south, but it'll be chained. She looked at Clara. Her voice was level, but her eyes were doing the cataloging thing, the assessment, and this time Clara held it without looking away. You stay behind me. You do not move unless I tell you to move. If I tell you to go back to the car, you go back to the car. Those are not negotiable. Understood. I mean it. I know you mean it, Clara said. Let's go. They moved through the shadow along the face of the loading dock. Renata ahead and Clara 3 feet behind, and the cold came off the river in gusts that pushed the smell of salt and diesel into their faces, and Clara's heart was doing something she could feel in her throat. Not fear exactly. Fear had a specific quality, a loosening, but something closer to the sensation of maximum aliveness, every nerve ending reporting in simultaneously. She had never done anything like this in her life. She had stood in a restaurant for 6 years and absorbed insults and done math that didn't work, and carried trays that were too heavy and made herself small enough to fit inside the space the world allocated to her, and she had never once run towards something dangerous in the dark. It felt, against all logic, like the most like herself she had been in years. The building was concrete block, large windows blacked out from the inside, a single metal door on the north face with a light above it that was working. 2 men outside the door, standing in the particular way of men who were being paid to stand somewhere and had been doing it long enough to be bored, but not long enough to be careless. Renata stopped at the corner of the adjacent building. She pressed her back against the wall, and Clara did the same, and Renata held up 2 fingers and pointed toward the door, and then held up 2 more fingers and pointed toward the south, and Clara understood, 2 visible, 2 elsewhere. She felt Renata's hand close briefly on her forearm. Stay. Then Renata was on her phone, thumb moving, and 30 seconds later the 2 men by the door looked at something on the south side of the building. A sound or a light, something that required both of them to turn. And when they turned, 2 shapes emerged from the darkness on the east side of the loading dock, with a speed and economy of motion that Clara would later struggle to describe accurately because it was over before her brain had fully processed that it had begun. The door was clear. Renata moved. Clara followed. Inside, the smell of the old market was stronger, cold concrete and rust, and beneath it something chemical, the residue of industrial cleaning that had not quite won its argument with the underlying history of the space. The interior was vast and poorly lit, the ceiling lost in darkness above the reach of the 2 work lights set up in the center of the floor, and the work lights threw hard shadows that gave everything they illuminated the quality of a stage set. Too bright, too defined, with darkness pressing in from all sides. Damien was in the center of the floor. He was on his feet. That was the first thing, the thing that mattered most, the thing that her body registered before anything else. Upright, hands behind him, which meant his hands were secured to something, a support beam or a chain she couldn't see from this distance. But he was standing. His jacket was gone and his shirt was torn at the collar, and there was blood on his face, a cut above the left eye, not deep, but persistent, the kind that bled disproportionately. And he was looking at the man standing 6 feet in front of him with an expression that she had never seen on him in 2.5 years of Tuesday and Thursday evenings, but that she recognized immediately. Damien Voss was not afraid. He was not broken. He was furious, in the deep core way of someone for whom fury was not a performance but a foundation. Not hot, not explosive, but cold and structural, the kind that didn't burn out because it didn't burn at all. It simply held. Vincent Calder was shorter than she'd imagined. 60, perhaps 62, with the build of a man who had once been physically formidable and was now formidable in different ways. He wore a coat that was too good for this building and stood with his hands clasped behind his back, which gave him the posture of a man inspecting something he was considering purchasing. Leo Caruso stood to Vincent's left. Clara had not seen Leo before. She saw him now. A man in his mid-50s with graying temples and the face of someone who had once looked younger and had not done so in some time. He stood slightly apart from Vincent, and the space between them contained a negotiation that had already happened and from which Leo had not fully emerged. He looked, she thought, like a man who had made the largest decision of his life and discovered, too late, that the size of the decision and the rightness of it were not the same thing. He was looking at Damien with an expression she couldn't name. Not triumph. Something that was trying to be nothing and failing. Renata's hand on Clara's arm, pressing her into the shadow behind a structural column. She could see but couldn't be seen, or couldn't be seen easily, and she pressed her back against the cold concrete and watched. "You've had 12 years from me," Damien was saying. His voice was completely level. Blood ran from the cut above his eye in a thin line that reached his jaw, and he did not appear to notice it. 12 years and everything that came with them. The question I have, the only question I actually care about answering before anything else happens tonight, is whether there was any part of those 12 years that was real, or whether I'm standing here because I misread the entire period. Vincent started to speak, and Damien said without raising his voice, "I'm not talking to you." Vincent stopped. Something moved across his face. Surprise. And beneath the surprise, a recalculation. Men in his position were not often interrupted. He absorbed it with the control of someone who had learned that the management of his own reactions was itself a form of power. Leo was looking at the floor now. "Look at me," Damien said. Leo looked up. 12 years, Damien said again. "Tell me." Something in Leo Caruso's face broke. Not dramatically. It was not the break of a man who was giving in, but the break of a man who had been holding something weight-bearing for a very long time and had reached the point where holding it was no longer architecturally possible. It cracked in his jaw first, then around his eyes, and he said, in a voice that was recognizably the voice of someone who had been practicing what they would say in this moment and found it inadequate to the actual moment, "It was both." Damien looked at him. "Both," Leo said. "All of it was real, and this is also real. I needed my son. The situation with my son." He stopped. His jaw worked. "You paid for the college, but the debt wasn't college. It was something I did 8 years ago, before you took over, before any of this was what it is now. I made a decision that created a debt I couldn't pay out of what you give me, and Vincent found it, and he gave me a choice." "When?" Damien said. 8 months ago. 8 months. Clara watched Damien absorb this number. 8 months of breakfasts and meetings, and Tuesday and Thursday evenings in a corner booth. 8 months of Leo Caruso knowing what he was doing and doing it anyway. And the number sat in the lit center of the warehouse floor between the two men like something physical. "You could have told me," Damien said. "I know. I would have." "I know," Leo said, louder now, rough. "I know what you would have done. That's—" He stopped. His hands, Clara could see from the shadow, were shaking slightly. Not from fear, she thought. From something that was trying to be a different emotion and couldn't complete the conversion. "That's why I didn't, because you would have handled it, and I would have owed you that too, and I—" He stopped again. "I have spent 12 years owing you things, Damien. I needed to clear one debt without creating another." The silence that followed was the heaviest silence of the night, and the night had had heavy silences. Then Vincent Calder said, with the tone of a man who had let a digression run its course and was returning to the agenda, "This is very moving, but the conversation I came here to have is the one about the Northeast Corridor, and I'd like to have it before the hour gets later." Damien looked at Vincent. He looked at him with the full weight of what she now understood was a man whose rage was not diminished by its containment, but compacted by it. Made denser, more load-bearing, more dangerous precisely because it took up less visible space. "The Northeast," Damien said, "is not for sale. Not to you. Not tonight. Not as the result of a conversation happening in a building where my hands are tied to a support beam." "Your hands will remain tied," Vincent said pleasantly, "until we have an agreement." "Then they stay tied." Vincent smiled. It was a patient smile, the smile of a man who had more time than the other person in the room and knew it. "Damien, I have been building this case for 8 months. I have your financial records, your operational structure, and the testimony of a man who has been inside your organization for over a decade. The other families have been briefed. The window for this to resolve quietly closed approximately 3 hours ago." He tilted his head slightly. "I'm offering you the opportunity to hand over the Northeast operation voluntarily and walk away from tonight with everything else intact. The alternative involves a process that will be expensive. For you, for the people around you." Clara heard the emphasis. The people around you. She felt something move through her that was not fear and was not fury, but was the synthesis of both. The precise operational clarity that came from the moment when the situation became simple, because all the complexity had been stripped away, and what remained was only what mattered. What mattered was the man in the center of the room, with blood running down his face, who had crouched on a restaurant floor beside her and picked up broken pieces without being asked. She stepped out of the shadow. Renata's hand shot out and missed her by half a second, and then Renata made a sound that was the quietest possible expression of a very loud feeling, and Clara was already moving into the light. Vincent Calder saw her first. His expression moved through several phases in rapid succession: recognition, confusion, reassessment, and then settled into something that was almost amused, which was worse. Damien saw her, and his face did something she had never seen it do. The fury dropped. Not the control, not the composure. Those held. They were load-bearing, and they held. But the fury dropped, and what replaced it, for one unguarded second, was something she could only describe as the expression of a man who had been in a very dark room for a very long time and had just watched someone walk through the wall. "Clara," he said, low. An entire conversation in 2 syllables. "I'm here," she said. She kept walking until she was standing in the full light of the work lamps, and she could see everything. The cut above Damien's eye, the chain on his wrists, Leo standing with his broken expression, Vincent with his patient smile, and the 2 men flanking Vincent who had straightened when she appeared and were watching her with the professional attention of people deciding whether she was a problem. She looked at Vincent Calder. She had spent her life being underestimated by men who looked like him. Men who stood in rooms with their hands behind their backs and made decisions about what other people were worth. She was very familiar with the look on his face. She had been receiving it since she was old enough to stand in front of people and have them decide, in the first 3 seconds, that she was not a relevant variable. She used it. "Mr. Calder," she said. Her voice was steady in the way that her voice was always steady when everything else was falling apart, which was a skill she had not previously considered valuable and was revising her assessment of in real time. "You've been building this case for 8 months. Forensic financial records, operational documentation, internal testimony." She watched his expression. The smile was still there, but it had changed in some minor way. A small shift in the muscles around his eyes. "That's a substantial investment of time and resources. It would be unfortunate if the documentation you've built were to be examined in a federal context rather than a private one." The smile stopped moving. "I have a friend," she said. I use the word loosely. She's the Assistant Director of the Financial Crimes Division of the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. She and I went to the same high school, and we have dinner twice a year, and I called her 40 minutes ago from a car on the way here. This was not true. None of it was true. But Clara Whitmore had been managing dangerous men in confined spaces for 6 years, and she knew, with the bone-deep instinct of long practice, the precise moment when a room shifted, the moment when the person with the power stopped performing certainty and started doing the math. "I told her about the financial documentation you've been building. I told her about the meeting that was supposed to happen today that you chose not to attend in person. I told her about the location we were going to tonight and what was happening in it." She paused. "She's a thorough person. She was going to pull everything regardless of what I told her next. The question I gave her was whether she pulled it quietly or loudly." Vincent Calder had gone very still. His 2 men were looking at him. Leo was looking at her. And Damien. Damien was looking at her with the expression of a man who was calculating in real time, not the content of what she was saying, but the woman who was saying it, recalibrating something in his understanding that had apparently been slightly off and was now correcting itself. "You're bluffing," Vincent said. His voice was still controlled, but the pleasantness had gone out of it the way warmth went out of a room when the heat was cut. Suddenly, completely, and with a cold that had been there all along underneath. "Maybe," Clara said. "Are you confident enough to find out?" The warehouse was very quiet. The river smell came through a gap somewhere in the roofline, cold and mineral, and the work lights hummed their single low note, and somewhere outside on Edgewater Road, a truck went past with the sound of heavy machinery moving through the night. And then it was quiet again. Vincent Calder looked at her for a long time. He looked at her the way men like him looked at things they had miscategorized, not with the anger of someone who had been beaten, but with the focused attention of someone revising a filing system, locating the correct drawer, deciding where to put the new information. Then he looked at Leo. Something passed between them in that look. The entire mechanism of the last 8 months, the debt, the deal, the 8 months of constructed advantage, and the single variable that had not been in the model because nobody had thought to put it there. A plus-sized waitress from the Bronx with a pasta stain on her work history, and $60 missing from her monthly payment arrangement, and a voice that did not shake. "Release him," Vincent said. One of his men moved to the support beam. Clara heard the chain, and then she heard Damien's breath. A single controlled exhale. The breath of a man whose body had been managing something for the last several hours and was being allowed to stop. And then he was standing free, rolling his wrists, his eyes on her. Vincent buttoned his coat. "This conversation," he said to the room in general and no one specifically, "is not concluded." "No," Damien said, "but tonight it is." Vincent walked out. His men followed. Leo stood for a moment in the empty center of the room, looking at Damien with the broken expression she'd seen before. And Damien looked back at him without speaking. And then Leo walked out too, and the warehouse door closed with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Renata appeared from the shadows with the expression of someone who had watched an operation go completely off plan and arrive at the correct destination by an entirely unauthorized route. Damien crossed the floor to where Clara was standing. He stopped in front of her. The blood from the cut above his eye had dried into a dark line on his jaw. He was looking at her in a way that she thought she would spend a long time trying to accurately remember, as though she had just performed a version of herself he had suspected was there and was now confronted with the evidence. "The assistant director of the Financial Crimes Division," he said. "I don't know anyone in the U.S. Attorney's Office," Clara said. "I know you don't." He didn't know that. "No," Damien said. He didn't. He was quiet for a moment. His hand came up, slowly, with the careful deliberateness of a man who was accustomed to measuring the force he applied to things and was applying very little. And his knuckles touched her jaw, briefly, the way you touched something you were confirming was real. "He thought you were someone who had nothing to lose." "I had everything to lose," Clara said. "I just decided the math worked out." He looked at her. His hand was still at her jaw. The work lights hummed, and outside the city went about its business with complete indifference to what had just happened inside this building. And then Renata said, from somewhere behind them both, in the tone of a woman who had been keeping the operational situation in mind while everyone else had been having a moment, "We need to move. Leo is not contained and Vincent is not finished, and I would like to do the rest of this from somewhere that is not a fish market." She was right. They all knew she was right. But Damien did not immediately move, and Clara did not step back, and the space between them held for one more second everything that had accumulated, and everything that was still coming, and everything that, one way or another, they were going to have to. They drove back in the same dark sedan, and nobody spoke for the first 6 minutes, which was the amount of time it took to clear Hunts Point and get back onto the elevated expressway, where the city opened up on both sides, and the lights of it ran in every direction like something that had no interest in the specific human drama moving through its middle. Renata drove. Damien sat in the front passenger seat with his head back against the headrest and his eyes on the ceiling of the car, not sleeping. She could see the muscle in his jaw working at intervals, slow and deliberate, the physical evidence of a mind still running at operational speed despite everything his body had been through. Clara sat in the back and watched the city move past the window and tried to locate herself inside the night, to find the thread that connected the woman who had walked into Enzo's trattoria at 3 p.m. yesterday with the woman who had just stood in a fish market in Hunts Point and told a lie to a crime boss's face without her voice breaking. The thread was there. It was thinner than she expected, but it held. Renata spoke first. "Leo is the immediate problem." Damien didn't move his head from the headrest. "I know. He's not contained. Vincent let him walk out, which means either he's still useful to Vincent or Vincent is done with him, and both of those options create different problems by morning. I know, Renata. If Leo talks to the other families before we do..." "Renata." Damien's voice was not sharp. It was the voice he used when something was settled, and he needed the conversation to acknowledge that. "I know. Give me until we get back to the building." Renata gave him until they got back to the building. Inside, she put coffee on without asking, and Damien sat at the kitchen table and Clara sat across from him, and for a moment it was the same geometry as the morning, the same table, the same chairs, the same kitchen light, but everything that filled the space between those fixed points had been replaced with something heavier and less theoretical. He looked at her. She looked back. "Your face," she said. "It's fine. It needs to be cleaned." "Clara." "Sit there," she said, and she got up and went to the cabinet under the sink where she had seen Renata store a first aid kit that morning, and she brought it back to the table and opened it, and she sat on the edge of the table beside him, and she cleaned the cut above his eye with the antiseptic and a piece of gauze while he held still with the patience of someone who had learned a long time ago that resisting the necessary was a waste of energy better conserved for the unnecessary. He winced once. Just once, when the antiseptic hit the deepest part of the cut. She felt the wince more than she saw it, a single involuntary tension in the muscle under her hand. "Sorry," she said. "Don't be. She put a small butterfly closure on the cut and pressed it down, and then she put her hand flat against the side of his face for a moment. Not deliberately, not as a decision, just as a thing that happened at the end of a sequence of actions that had brought her hand to that place and found no resistance there. His hand came up and covered hers. Both of them stayed very still for a moment, like two people who had been running hard and had simultaneously decided to stop, and were now standing in the silence of having stopped and discovering it felt like something. "Tell me what you're going to do about Leo," she said. He took her hand down from his face, but he didn't let go of it, and she found she didn't pull it back. "Leo needs to make a statement," he said. "Voluntary, documented, witnessed. Describing the nature of Vincent Calder's approach 8 months ago, the leverage used, the information he was asked to provide and did provide. Full account, nothing omitted." "Will he do it?" "I think yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Not because he owes me. He knows I know he owes me. That's part of the problem. That's why he didn't come to me 8 months ago. He'll do it because it's the only version of what he did that his son can eventually understand. The version where he was coerced, where the pressure was real, where he tried to limit the damage even at the end." He paused. "Marcus's call tonight, the warehouse location. That wasn't Marcus working independently. Leo gave him the location." Clara looked at him. "Leo told Marcus where Vincent was taking me," Damien said. "He didn't stop the meeting from happening, but he made sure someone knew where I was. That's what he had left. One thing, small enough to be deniable, significant enough to matter." He looked at their hands. A man who has gone all the way over doesn't leave the door unlocked on his way out. Leo left the door unlocked. That's what I'm working with. "And Vincent," Clara said. Damien was quiet for longer this time. Renata was moving somewhere in the building. Footsteps, a door, the distant sound of a phone call being conducted at a volume and register designed not to carry. And outside the kitchen window, the city was doing what it did at 2 a.m, which was continue without apology. "Vincent built this over 8 months," he said. "He built it carefully, using a real asset inside my organization. And the play was elegant, but it rested on a single assumption that when it was finally executed, I would be isolated. That I would walk into that warehouse alone and come out with nothing." He looked up. The assumption was wrong. "Because of me," she said. Not vain, just accurate. The same way she would have said the cut is above your eye or the coffee is done. "Because of you," he said. "Marcus told me the location. I can't take credit for—" "Marcus told you the location because you called him," Damien said. "That call is you. The decision to step out of that shadow and into the light is you. What you said to Vincent and how you said it, and the fact that you said it at all, that is entirely and specifically you." He held her gaze. "I need you to understand that I am not diminishing what happened tonight by locating its cause. I'm doing the opposite." She understood. She sat with it for a moment, feeling the weight of it. Not the compliment, but the accuracy. She had done those things. She had made those choices. She had walked into the light in a fish market in Hunts Point with no weapon and no backup and nothing except the willingness to be completely present in a room where presence was the only leverage available, and it had been enough. Not because she was exceptional, because she had stopped subtracting herself from the equation. "I need to make some calls," Damien said. He stood, and the chair scraped on the tile, and he looked down at her with the expression she had been cataloging all night. The one that had no clean name, the one that lived in the space between what was appropriate to this situation and what was true, regardless of appropriateness. "Will you stay?" "Tonight?" "Tonight, and for whatever comes after tonight that requires it." He paused. "I'm not asking you to make a permanent decision at 2 a.m. after the night we've had. I'm asking if you'll still be in this building when the calls are done." She looked at him. "Yes." He nodded once and went to make the calls. Renata appeared in the kitchen doorway a few minutes later and poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table with the manner of someone who had earned this specific cup of coffee through specific means and intended to drink it properly. "You know," she said without preamble, "in 11 years I have watched 3 people try to play Vincent Calder in a room and come out ahead." Clara wrapped her hands around her own cup. "How'd the other 2 do it?" "One of them had a gun." Renata took a drink of her coffee. The other one was Damien. She set the cup down. You didn't have either. I had the room, Clara said. He'd already decided I didn't matter. That's a significant advantage. Renata looked at her with the assessment expression, the one that cataloged without sentiment, and this time, when it completed its evaluation, it produced something that was not quite a smile. Renata did not appear to possess the infrastructure for a full smile, but was a relaxation of the architecture around her eyes that served the same function. Get some sleep, Renata said. Tomorrow will be its own thing. Tomorrow was in fact its own thing. Damien was on the phone for 4 hours. Clara slept in the small room upstairs and woke at 6 to the sound of voices below. Not agitated, not elevated, but the sustained low frequency of people working through something complex. And she lay on her back and looked at the ceiling and listened to the building around her and felt, for the first time in longer than she could accurately locate, the sensation of being somewhere that held her rather than somewhere she was simply occupying. She went downstairs at 7. Damien was at the kitchen table with 3 phones and a legal pad covered in handwriting, and the look of a man who had not slept and had used the hours he would have spent sleeping in a manner he considered equivalent. He looked up when she came in. Leo will make the statement, he said. This morning, Renata is with him now. Clara went to the coffee pot. And the other families. I spoke to both of them at length between 3 and 5 this morning. The one who'd indicated support for Vincent's position has withdrawn that indication. The non-committal one is now leaning toward a formal joint review of the Northeast Corridor situation. He paused. In plain language, neither of them wants to be on the record as having supported Vincent Calder's methodology once Leo's account is documented and in circulation. Because they didn't know he'd used a coerced insider. Because they didn't know. Or because they did know and have decided, in light of current circumstances, that they didn't. He made a small sound that was not quite humor, but acknowledged the existence of humor somewhere in the vicinity. It amounts to the same thing. Clara poured 2 cups of coffee and brought them both to the table and sat down. And the Northeast, she said, stays. He picked up the coffee without looking away from her. Vincent doesn't have a case that holds if Leo recants. The financial documentation he gathered was obtained through coercion. Leo's statement establishes that. The forensic advantage Vincent built over 8 months becomes a liability the moment it's reframed as evidence of his own methods. He'll know that. Yes. So he'll regroup, make another move eventually. Yes. In 6 months or a year when the current situation is settled and the other families have moved on to other concerns, Vincent Calder will try something else. Damien said this with the equanimity of someone who had made peace with a recurring condition. That's the nature of the thing. There is no version of this life where someone is not eventually trying something. The question is whether you're in a strong enough position to meet it when it comes. And this morning I am. Clara looked at him across the kitchen table. The morning light came through the window above the sink and hit the side of his face and made the closed cut above his eye look worse than it probably was. And he looked tired in the way that she was beginning to understand was his baseline, rather than an aberration. Not depleted, but occupied, carrying the constant low-grade weight of someone who was responsible for more than one person's safety at all times. She thought about Thursday night, 5 days ago. The tray tipping, the sound of plates on the floor, the specific quality of the room's silence. She thought about Marcus Calder's laugh, and the way her body had built a wall around the humiliation to make it bearable, and the way Damien had stood up from the corner booth without haste or theater. She thought about crouching on the restaurant floor picking up broken ceramic alongside a man in a dark suit who was supposedly the most feared person in the borough, and the feeling she'd had in that moment. Not gratitude, not relief, but something older and more fundamental. The feeling of being considered. Of someone doing the arithmetic of the situation and putting her in the equation not as the damage, but as the person to whom damage had been done. She had spent 28 years being the damage, the inconvenience, the variable that needed to be accommodated or managed or minimized. I need to get some things from my apartment, she said. Damien set down his cup. I'll go myself, she said. With someone, if that's what's needed. But I'll go myself. She held his gaze. I need to go back there and stand in it and decide what I'm taking out of it and leave the rest behind properly. Not have it packed by someone who doesn't know which things matter. He looked at her for a moment. Which things matter? My mother's photograph, the one on the windowsill in the bedroom, some books, the plant on the fire escape that's been dying since April and that I have been unwilling to admit is dead. The plant is dead. I know the plant is dead, she said, but it's my dead plant. Something happened in his face again. The thing she'd learned to read, the slight decrease in internal pressure, the thing that was not a smile but held a smile's function. It lasted about 2 seconds. I'll come with you, he said. You have calls to make. I have calls I'm choosing not to prioritize right now. She looked at him. Damien, if you come with me to my apartment to collect a dead plant, that's a statement. I'm aware. To whoever is watching, to Renata, to yourself. She paused. To me. I'm aware of all of those things, he said. I'd like to come anyway. She held his gaze across the table, and the morning light moved a fraction on the floor between them, and she thought about what she'd said in the warehouse. I had everything to lose, and what it meant to apply that same arithmetic now, in a kitchen, over coffee, in the face of something that was not dangerous in any of the ways the last 5 days had been dangerous, and was dangerous in every other way. Okay, she said. They went to her apartment at 9 in the morning, a Friday, the sky clear for the first time in a week. 2 of Renata's people followed in a separate car and stayed on the street, which was the compromise she'd negotiated without needing to negotiate because Damien had already arranged it without being asked, knowing she would want the independence of the gesture even while accepting the practical reality of the protection. Her building was a 5-story walk-up on a block she had lived on for 4 years. The super was in the lobby when they came in. A man named Garces, who had been rerouting the electricity for his own television since before she moved in, and who noticed everything. And he looked at Clara and then at Damien, and his expression completed a rapid and complex calculation before settling into a neutrality so deliberate it communicated everything. They went up the stairs. Her apartment was exactly as she'd left it Thursday morning, which felt impossible given the span of experience that had accumulated since Thursday morning. The window in the bedroom didn't close all the way. The stack of bills on the kitchen table was still there, and the hospital payment arrangement letter on top, and the handwritten note to herself that said $60 by Friday, which was today. Damien stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at the note. She watched him read it. She watched him understand it. Not the surface of it, but the structure underneath it, the architecture of a life managed on the tightest possible tolerances, where $60 was not a small thing, but the specific difference between this month holding together and this month becoming next month's emergency. He said nothing. He looked at the note, and then he looked at her and he said nothing, and she was grateful for that, for the fact that he didn't offer to fix it, didn't make a gesture toward the number, didn't try to absorb the problem into the larger practical machinery of protection and provision that he was already arranging around her life. He just looked at her with an understanding that had no transaction attached to it. She took the photograph from the bedroom windowsill, her mother at 40, standing in front of a house in the Catskills that they had rented for a single week during one summer when Clara was 11, the only week she could ever remember when the math had worked and the worry had been absent, and her mother had stood in front of a house in the mountains and laughed at something outside the frame. She wrapped it in a sweater from the closet and put it in the bag she'd brought. She took 3 books. She took the bag from the back of the bathroom door where she kept her important documents, birth certificate, social security card, the folder containing her mother's medical history and current medication list. She went to the fire escape. The plant was, definitively and without question, dead. It had been a pothos, which were famously difficult to kill, which told you something about the conditions under which it had been attempting to survive. The pot was terracotta, cracked slightly along the base, and the soil had gone to dust. She picked up the pot. Damien was leaning against the window frame watching her. She carried the pot back inside and set it on the kitchen table next to the bills and the $60 note, and she looked at it for a moment, and then she picked it up again and put it in the bag. "It's dead," he said. "I know. You're taking it anyway." "Yes." He looked at her with that expression, the one she kept trying to name and kept failing, the one that seemed to be doing several things simultaneously, cataloging and calculating and being simply present all at once. Then he said, "I had a dog when I was 14, a German Shepherd named Marco. He died and I kept his collar in my desk drawer for 11 years. She looked at him. The collar was just a collar, he said, but it was also the dog. Some things are both. She zipped the bag. She looked around the apartment one more time. The window that didn't close, the kitchen table, the view of the alley from the fire escape where she'd stood 10,000 times watching the day start or end. It was not a good apartment. It had never been a good apartment. But it was the place where she had been herself privately, without performance, in all the ways that mattered and some ways that didn't. And she held it for one more moment before she let it become history. Okay, she said, let's go. Leo Caruso's formal statement was filed with an attorney and witnessed by Renata and 2 members of the Northeast Partnership on a Friday afternoon. It ran to 11 pages and described in granular detail the nature of Vincent Calder's approach in February, the leverage applied, a debt from a transaction 8 years earlier that Leo had concealed from Damien and that Vincent had discovered through his own information networks, and the operational data that Leo had provided over the 8 months following. It described the night at Enzo's Trattoria as a deliberate staging. Marcus's appearance choreographed to create a documented grievance, the subsequent meeting designed to extract concessions under the framing of reparation for a son's honor. It also noted, without being asked, that it was Leo who had told Marcus Calder the location of the Hunts Point warehouse. This last detail was not legally significant. In the context of the document as a whole, in the context of what the document was doing and what it would set in motion, it was one sentence among many. But Damien read it, and he paused on it, and Clara was sitting across the table when he read it, and she watched him pause and she saw what happened in his face when he did. He didn't say anything about it. He set the document down and he turned the page and he continued reading. But she had seen it, the specific quality of what moved through him in that pause, something that was not forgiveness exactly, but was the acknowledgement of a human being doing the best available thing with the worst available materials, and the decision to hold that fact alongside everything else rather than discard it. Leo Caruso lost his position in the organization. That was not something that could be undone by a statement or a warehouse door left unlocked or 11 years of prior loyalty. He lost his position and his income and the infrastructure of a life built around one man's trust, and he was 56 years old and would have to locate himself in the world outside that structure. Damien paid the debt that Vincent Calder had used as leverage, fully, without conditions, without requiring Leo to ask. He told Renata to make the arrangement, and he told her to make it anonymous, and Renata looked at him for a moment in the specific way she sometimes looked at him, and then did it without comment. Clara asked him about it that evening. They were in the front room of the brownstone, the window dark behind them, the city doing its irrelevant and continuous thing outside. He was on the couch with a glass of water and the legal pad, still making notes even at this hour, because this was who he was. A man for whom the operational and the personal were not separate systems, but ran on the same engine and required the same attention. "You paid Leo's debt," she said. "Yes. After everything he did?" "After everything," he said. He made a small mark on the legal pad and then he looked up. He was coerced. What he was coerced into doing was severe and cost me significantly. Both things are true simultaneously. Most people don't have the resources, he said. Having them and not using them to close out something like that is a choice I don't want to make. He paused. Also, his son didn't know any of this. The son is 19. If I leave the debt open, it follows the son. That's not the son's debt to carry. Clara looked at him. She had been looking at him differently for 2 days, or perhaps the same way she had always looked at him, and had only recently started seeing what the looking contained. She thought about what he'd said the night before the warehouse, standing at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at her. "Whoever you are to me, which I don't have the right language for yet." "I want to talk about something," she said. He set down the legal pad. "I've been trying to make myself smaller my whole life," she said, "not as a strategy, as a reflex. Because the world made it very clear from a young age that the space I naturally occupied was inconvenient, and the polite thing was to minimize it." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not going to do that in this situation, whatever this is. I'm not going to pre-apologize for taking up space or convince myself that what I feel is less than what it is to make it easier for everyone, including myself." Damien was very still. "I feel things about you that are significant," she said. "I have for a while. I noticed them and then I filed them somewhere I didn't intend to examine, because examining them seemed insane given the observable facts of our relative positions. But the observable facts of our relative positions have changed somewhat over the last 5 days, and I find I no longer have a coherent argument for the filing system. He was quiet for a moment. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed outside. "When you left the restaurant Thursday night," he said, "before the car, the first 2 nights I sat in that booth after you were gone, before I knew anything about what was happening on the street, I sat there and I thought about the way you said back to your tables, like it was both ordinary and also somehow the most clear-eyed assessment of the situation anyone had made all evening." He paused, and I thought about the cut on your hand from the broken plate that you didn't mention and didn't have attended to and just wrapped in a side towel and kept working through. She'd forgotten about the cut. It had healed already, mostly, a thin line along the edge of her palm. "I had been watching you manage a world that was consistently unkind to you," he said, "for 2.5 years, and the thing I found I couldn't stop thinking about in that booth was that you had never once, not once, asked me for anything. Not help, not protection, not the kind of consideration that my being in that corner booth might theoretically have offered you." He looked at her. "You treated me like an ordinary person in a restaurant. You have no idea what that meant in the context of my life." She looked at her hands. "It meant," she said, "that I was doing my job." "It meant," he said, "that you were being yourself. And yourself turns out to be someone I find I can't locate a version of my future that doesn't include." The room was very quiet. She looked at him across the space of the couch. This man in his 40th year with a butterfly closure above his eye and a legal pad full of crisis management notes on his lap, who had crouched on a restaurant floor without being asked, and stood in a warehouse in Hunts Point with blood on his face and without flinching, and who had just said the most direct thing she had ever heard anyone say about wanting her without softening it or hedging it or asking permission first. "That's a significant thing to say," she said. "I know." "You're sure?" "Clara," he said, and the way he said her name had the same quality it always had, direct, specific, like it belonged to her and he was simply confirming the ownership. "I have made my decisions carefully for 20 years. I am sure." She got up from her chair and she sat beside him on the couch, close, but not touching. Not yet, because this was a thing that was going to happen in its own time and at its own pace, and she intended to be fully present for all of it rather than hurrying through the early parts towards some imagined resolution. She reached over and picked up the legal pad. She looked at the notes, operational, structured, the handwriting of a man who organized his thoughts in clean lines and didn't waste space. She found a blank corner at the bottom of a page. She wrote, $60, paid. And then, next to it, in smaller script, plant, alive enough. She handed it back to him. He looked at what she'd written. He looked at it for a long time, and she watched the thing happen in his face that she had been watching for 2.5 years without understanding what she was seeing, and now she understood it completely. It was relief. The specific relief of a man who had been waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for someone to look at the margin of his life and find something worth writing in it. He set the legal pad on the coffee table. Outside, the city continued. It had no opinion about what was happening in this room, no investment in its outcome, no awareness that 2 people were sitting on a couch in Riverdale with the accumulated weight of 5 extraordinary days between them and the ordinary and extraordinary days ahead of them still unwritten. The city just ran its lights and moved its traffic and generated its constant low noise, the same as it had on Thursday evening, when Clara Whitmore had walked out the back door of Enzo's trattoria into the rain and noticed a car moving too slowly on a wet street. She had gotten into a different car. She had answered a call from an unknown number. She had walked out of a shadow and into a light she couldn't see the edges of. And she had not disappeared, and she had not made herself small. And the woman she was now, sitting in this room in this quiet, was exactly the woman she had always been. The one who had been there all along underneath the apology, underneath the reflex, underneath the careful disappearing act she had spent 28 years perfecting. She was done perfecting it. The plant sat in its cracked terracotta pot on the kitchen table of a brownstone in Riverdale, with the city outside and the night coming down and 2 people inside who had each, through means that neither had anticipated and could not have designed, found the one thing that all the power and all the money and all the carefully maintained armor in the world could not provide and could not protect once lost. Someone who looked at exactly what they were and decided it was enough. It was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the only thing. And for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, Clara Whitmore did not feel the need to make it smaller.